Ole Miss versus South Carolina is going to be the most intense game this season.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, I'm Stephen Willis, a former staff member at Ole Miss and a 10-year veteran member of the national media with Yahoo Sports. Today on the show, we talk about Ole Miss and their most intense game on the schedule, which is the South Carolina Gamecocks. We talk about why that is the case and talk to Andrew Lyon from Locked On Gamecocks to get his takes as well. Make no mistake, if Ole Miss plays clean, they're going to beat South Carolina, but there's several things around this game that will affect that. We talk about Jaxson Dart and him performing on the road and what Ole Miss fans will consider a successful season this year. This is the Locked On Ole Miss Podcast, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're free and available on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day, and a special hello to the everydayers who make the show what it is. July 2nd at 7 p.m. Central Time, you can join us at Walk-Ons in Ridgeland, Mississippi for a little bit of a meet and greet. It's sure to be a lot of fun and a way for the Loom community to meet and grow. So see you there. And also there's still time to join the Grove Collective and help Ole Miss football be elite. You can go to thegrovecollective.com and join today. Interesting stuff. And just so everybody knows, before we get started, Ole Miss hired a pitching coach for baseball, Joel Mangrum. He was the minor league pitching coordinator for the Cleveland Guardians, and anybody that follows Major League Baseball knows that Cleveland is usually pretty good at pitching the ball. So that got done as well. But Ole Miss will have their most intense game of the season against the South Carolina Gamecocks. And why is that the case? Why is that something that we should be thinking about? And why is this game going to be intense? Well, the main reason this game is going to be intense has nothing to do with Ole Miss, and it has everything to do with Juice Wells. Antoine Juice Wells in South Carolina in 2022 had 68 catches, 928 yards, 6 touchdowns. Really good year for the South Carolina Gamecock. Juice Wells going into last season was pretty much the number one wide receiver in the whole Southeastern Conference, if you ask anybody last season. But he got injured, and he wasn't quite right. And he ended up with like 39 yards receiving over the course of the year. People say that he shut it down after playing a couple of games when he could have played. And then he transferred to Ole Miss, and it started like this huge backlash against Antoine Juice Wells by the South Carolina fan base. Now, South Carolina fans, I'm going to say this a little bit later on with Andrew Lyon, but Juice Wells had to have surgery immediate upon arrival at Ole Miss. He missed all of the spring practice. He is only just now participating, I think, in full summer workouts. He was injured. He was really injured. This wasn't a situation of being selfish and trying to get a bag. That's not the case at all. Juice Wells has handled all of this above board, and he's been fine. But the reason this game is going to be intense is because South Carolina fans won't listen to any of that. In their mind, Juice Wells was standing outside of Shane Beamer in the offensive coordinator's office saying, "I'm not going to play. I want to thank you for your NIL money. I want to thank you for your scholarship money. But I am not going to get on the field and burn my red shirt so I can go play college football again and get another bag and another scholarship." That is what South Carolina fans think happened. And because of that, they've been allowed to simmer on that for the better part of 7 months right now. And they're getting madder and madder and madder to the point where the game that they're most looking forward to on the schedule is a game against Ole Miss. And Ole Miss and South Carolina rarely play. It's just not a game that is played that often as far as members of the Southeastern Conference. This year, they are looking forward to it. And Ole Miss fans, you need to worry about this, not necessarily because it's a trap, Because if Ole Miss plays clean, if Ole Miss does what they're supposed to do, they're going to win this game. They have a better football team than South Carolina. But there are several landmines that Ole Miss needs to look out for that will keep them from playing well. And the slower they play, the more of a chance of an upset to happen. And the first thing you need to realize is this game is early enough in the season to where South Carolina's record has not just completely did them in. This is a year that Shane Beamer is on the hot seat, and it's a year that can go completely sideways for Beamer. But this is the 5th game of the season. And at worst, at the absolute worst, South Carolina is going to be 2-2 playing in this contest with losses to Kentucky and LSU. No shame in that. To where their whole season's in front of them and all of their want to is going to be there. The fan base is not going to be discouraged. They're going to have hope. They're going to want to be up for this game. This game means a ton to South Carolina. There's a bye week immediately preceding the game as well, which means they're going to work up some stuff to surprise Ole Miss in this game. Like I said, Ole Miss has the better, more talented football team, the better quarterback, the better running backs, the better wide receivers, the better defensive line, the better offensive line. If you go down the list, Ole Miss is better at most every position. But as we've seen in college football, that isn't necessarily how you win football games. And in every team sport, the goal is to be playing at a pace that is fast enough to where the other team gets uncomfortable and they can't do it. That's team sports right there. It doesn't matter what sport you're playing. It's all about playing at a pace at a level that makes your opponent uncomfortable. That's what it's all about. So Ole Miss needs to play fast. They need to execute quickly. They need to not turn the ball over. They need to do whatever they can to not let South Carolina into the game. If they do that, they're going to be fine. South Carolina has some guys on their roster. They have some talent. South Carolina is a very, very difficult place to play. I talked to Bill Flowers like, hey, Bill, what is the most difficult place that you went into when you played SEC? And it blew my mind that he talked about playing in South Carolina, which I'm assuming that would be in 2004. Playing in that environment, that was a day game. And in that happening, he said that was the most intense place that he played. He played in Baton Rouge, he played in Alabama, he played in Auburn, he played at a lot of places in the Southeastern Conference. Bill mentioned South Carolina, which means this game has a chance to be a cauldron when you take into effect that all of the fans have a burning desire to beat Juice Wells. And Andrew Lyon asked, who does this game mean more to? And either South Carolina fans or Juice Wells. That was the choice. So understand that you're walking into a little bit of a cauldron type environment. South Carolina is going to be good enough to where the fans care, to where they can get up. It is going to be a cauldron because they desperately want to beat Juice Wells. They have a bye week the week before, and Ole Miss, this is the third part of that. Ole Miss the next week plays LSU. One of the 2 games on Ole Miss's schedule they're being pointed to. And one of the 2 games on the schedule right now that Ole Miss is underdogs in. That game means that there are some trap tendencies in this game. I do not think this game is a trap. I do not think that at this point South Carolina is necessarily good enough for it to be a trap. But all of the indicators are there of Ole Miss, how they could play worse, with LSU being the following week in Williams-Brice Stadium, potentially a night game. I don't know how that game got flexed when Ole Miss can't get a flex game at home, period. But we'll see how it happens. This should be a very, very interesting ball game. Thanks again for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen of the day. We talked to Andrew Lyon from Locked On Gamecocks to find out what they are interested in about this game. Hint, it doesn't take long before he starts talking about Juice Wells. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has all of the parts you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. And with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home some huge wins. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume with all of that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 streaming channel program for you each and every single day to bring you the biggest stories without all of that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Let's go to Andrew Lyon. We're doing some crossover action, talking South Carolina Gamecocks. Let's go.
Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen, wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, or your first watch on YouTube. We're going to continue to do some season previews on today's show, as South Carolina got a very intriguing game this upcoming season with the Ole Miss Rebels. So to talk about this game a little bit more, I'm going to be chatting here with Locked On Ole Miss host Stephen Willis. You can find all of his stuff with Locked On Ole Miss on YouTube, wherever you get your audio podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. I believe Stephen Willis even has a TikTok as well. So he's always pumping out content over on these social media platforms. Stephen, how you doing today?
I am doing quite well, man. Andrew, it's nice to join you on the show to talk a little bit about Juice Wells. No, I'm kidding. We'll talk a little bit about the Ole Miss South Carolina game.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of intriguing aspects, Stephen, about this game. It's the first time I think the Gamecocks and Rebels have played since 2020, the COVID season. And honestly, that was the game that pretty much sealed Will Muschamp's fate here in Columbia, as they lost a
that was the clipboard game.
Oh, yeah, that was absolutely the clipboard game. So you know that clip's going to get played a lot previewing that game as it approaches. But, Stephen, you mentioned it earlier, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. Antoine Juice Wells, former wide receiver at South Carolina, decides to enter the portal this offseason, goes over to Ole Miss to join up with Jaxson Dart in this Lane Kiffin offense. And obviously some hard feelings on South Carolina's end, some mixed stories depending on who you ask. Some South Carolina fans might say Juice Wells could have played and chose not to. Some other people might say, hey, Juice Wells had a much worse injury than people outside of both buildings realize. So, Stephen, going into this game, who do you think is going to have more incentive to win? Do you think it's going to be South Carolina, maybe the fan base and how rowdy they get? Or do you think it's going to be Antoine Juice Wells with all the stuff he's heard over the past few months?
I think it's going to be Juice Wells, honestly, because the rumor that got started about how Juice Wells just chose not to play and all of that narrative that happened. Well, as soon as he transferred to Ole Miss, he ended up having surgery, which means he actually was injured. So South Carolina fans understand that he was not faking it. He had to be injured. He was completely shut down for spring practice at Ole Miss, and he might be ready by mid-June or mid to late June to participate in summer workouts. So it's not a situation where Juice was faking it. Although if the rumors are true to where he was booed at his graduation, that's kind of an interesting type situation that probably is not the best of looks for South Carolina.
No, certainly not. And there were definitely a lot of Gamecock fans that I can't say that did happen. And there were a lot of Gamecock fans that were against that, obviously, because graduation, one of the biggest moments of the young man's life. And, some people let their emotions get the best of them, but definitely going to lead to, I think, a lot of intensity between both sides going to that game. And Stephen, honestly, when it comes to the player aspect of this, I think sometimes people overblow, how the players might go up against one another. I don't think South Carolina players are going to have a bunch of hatred towards Juice Wells coming into this game. And I think you could say the same thing about Antoine. So certainly the biggest storyline from an in-game standpoint. But when you look at this game, Stephen, from a bird's eye view, the schedule dynamic.
Real quick also, before we move on. I did a little short, I don't know, a couple months back where I interviewed Juice Wells. Juice Wells came on the show and talked about that. And he had a little soundbite that sounded like that he was taking a shot at South Carolina's quarterback, and he wasn't. He wasn't doing that. He was just talking about that he had a chance to go play for Jaxson Dart, who was going into his third year of school, and he was propping him up a little bit more than taking a shot at the South Carolina quarterback. And I think it blew up in that Palmetto State, and it's like, good grief, my tweet absolutely went nuts about that. And that's when I was like, okay, this Juice Wells thing going back to South Carolina, it's got a little bit of juice to it. No pun intended.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And of course, that quarterback you're referring to is South Carolina quarterback Lenore Sellers, taking over for Spencer Rattler, who has now moved on to the NFL. Now, Stephen, looking at this game from a 30,000-foot view, the schedule dynamic, I think, is quite interesting. South Carolina got a really early bye week. And of course, this year, every team in the SEC's got 2 bye weeks. South Carolina's first one will be the week before this game against Ole Miss. And then they got to go on the road and play Kalen DeBoer and the Alabama Crimson Tide after this game against the Rebels. And then for Ole Miss, they got to play Kentucky at home the week prior. Certainly more talented than Kentucky, but the Wildcats are pretty physical. That's their style of football. And then they got to go on the road to play LSU the following week. And plus, this game is a flex game, which means that from a TV standpoint, it's going to take place sometime between 3:30 to 8 o'clock. At least that's when the game is set to kick off. So how do you feel about the schedule dynamic aspect, Stephen? Do you think it favors one team or the other? Or do you think it's about dead even in that regard?
I think it's the talent on the field. Ole Miss is going to be the more talented football team in this game. No, they just are. But the schedule dynamics is definitely in favor of South Carolina. So if they flex it and it's a night game, I've had Bill Flowers on my show. I've had another former player on the show, and they all said the most difficult place that they played was Williams-Brice Stadium. And that's weird coming from an Ole Miss player talking about that, because they don't play that often. So whenever an Ole Miss player says that, your ears kind of perk up a little bit. So a night game, there's obviously going to be flashbacks in Ole Miss fans of the 2009 game. I guess that was the arrival of South Carolina onto the scene, and Ole Miss losing the game in Williams-Brice. But talent on the field, Ole Miss should have the significantly more talented team. So the schedule dynamics help South Carolina out quite a bit. Now, the other thing that is going to help South Carolina out a bit is the next week, I believe Ole Miss takes on LSU. And that will be the first of 2 games that are severely looked at by outsiders at Ole Miss. Everybody is going to be pointing at those games, and that LSU game is going to get a lot of attention. So there's a chance for a sandwich game type effect, even at Williams-Brice. So there are things that could make this tricky for Ole Miss. But if Ole Miss goes to the South Carolina game and plays clean, they do the stuff, they don't do anything crazy. They don't give up explosive plays. They should win the game, but you can see how this game could go sideways on them.
Right. And that's the beauty about the SEC. Certainly every week you got some obvious, talent disadvantages that some teams are at, but, home environments and home crowds, they can make up for that. And obviously the trap game sort of deal as well. Now, talking about the players in this game, once again, Stephen, let's go to Jaxson Dart. Obviously the starting quarterback for Ole Miss. Jaxson Dart, I would say, is obviously a preseason Heisman Trophy contender coming into this year, going to his 3rd year as the starter over there in Oxford. And 2023 was a really good year for Jaxson Dart. I believe he threw 23 touchdowns compared to 5 interceptions. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But his road stats, they're not quite as good as his home stats. He completed just 59.6% of his passes in 5 road games this past fall, and he had a touchdown interception ratio of 1.75, only throwing 1 interception at home the entire season. So when you look at all the hype, you look at the Juice Wells situation and the schedule dynamic aspect, combining all of that and putting it on the shoulders of Jaxson Dart, Stephen, does it concern Rebel fans a little bit that, hey, this could be a game where Dart maybe has a couple costly turnovers, or do you think this will be a different Jaxson Dart coming into this season?
I don't think you can make too much of his road splits last year because two of the games that he had to play was at Georgia and at Alabama.
That's fair.
And so that was going to affect the splits overall with what happened. So Jaxson Dart going against Penn State in the Peach Bowl was absolutely nails. He looked like a top 5 quarterback in the country. And I like to compare Jaxson Dart, like, where would he be on the Mount Rushmore of Ole Miss quarterbacks after this season? And if Jaxson Dart makes a playoff game, he goes to the tippity top. He passes Eli Manning. He passes Archie Manning. I think Jaxson Dart is analogous, and you guys, you South Carolina fans, probably understand this more than anything. He kind of has a little Connor Shaw in him. He just wins football games. He won 11 games a year ago. He had a little bit of struggle at the end of the year when Lane Kiffin to Auburn and all of that stuff was going on as a sophomore. If he wins 11, 12 games again this season, I'm telling you, in the pantheon of Ole Miss football, Jaxson Dart has a chance to completely stand alone.
Yeah, and certainly would be great company being alongside Archie Manning and Eli Manning. Obviously, the Manning family carries a lot of weight when it comes to the sport of football. So if Jaxson Dart can accomplish that, I would say he would have had a great season down there in Oxford. And with great seasons, Ole Miss expectations have changed down there in Mississippi. So when we come back in just a couple moments, Stephen Willis and I will discuss what could Ole Miss accomplish this upcoming season. Could the defense catch up to the offense? Could a college football playoff berth be in their midst? We'll touch on all of that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks and the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, where we cover your teams every single day in 30 minutes or less. Stephen, let's talk about the Ole Miss Rebels specifically to end today's show. Starting off with Pete Golding. Obviously, big-time get for Lane Kiffin on his coaching staff this past offseason. And the Rebels, I would say they were pretty good bend but don't break defense this past year. But obviously, against, again, teams like Georgia and Alabama, which would have been the case for most teams, they did struggle a little bit. But you bring in some big-time talent on that side of the ball, specifically Walter Nolan from Texas A&M and Princely from Florida. Not going to try to pronounce the last name. Not going to do it. I'll get ripped up for it on my end, but you bring in those two guys, and it feels like that this could be the season where Ole Miss, they see maybe that shark defense come back in Oxford. The defense finally catches up to Lane Kiffin's offense. Do you think that's going to be the case?
I really do. I think the defense is going to be a surprise because last season, Ole Miss won 11 football games last year. Pete Golding's defense feasted on mid to bad offenses last season. If you were a mid to bad offense, you had no chance. Like Penn State, Arkansas, Vanderbilt, they had no chance to really be successful. Now, if you had a really good offense like LSU, like Alabama, like Georgia, that was a little bit of a different story. And you saw Pete Golding addressing the fact that, hey, we had trouble matching up with those NFL wide receivers and those NFL offensive linemen. So we need to kind of hit the portal. And so Pete Golding went out and got a Walter Nolan. He got a Princely Amonmielen. He got a Chris Pupal from Arkansas. You look at the secondary, they got a couple of really man coverage stalwart players in Trey Amos and Isaiah Hamilton that is going to lock up with the pressure that this defensive line and this front seven is going to provide. You needed some ball hawks back in the back. And then they got some safeties with Key Lawrence and Yam Banks and Lewis Moore, who has a chance to be an under the radar type player, to go with John Saunders that is returning and Trey Washington. And this defense has a chance to be good. And so what you're probably going to see, everybody remembers the Ole Miss LSU game from a year ago, to where it was just up and down the field, to where, the score was just completely outrageous. It's one of the best football games I've ever seen in my life. But LSU had the ball in the air to win the game. And this year, the idea is that's a 2 touchdown game. that ball doesn't matter in the air. The offense is just as good as it was a year ago, if not better. The defense has a chance to at least be a top 20 unit in the entire country.
Right. And by the way, I said shark defense earlier. I mean land shark defense. So forgive me, Ole Miss fans, if you're upset about that. But looking at the entire season as a whole, Stephen, it feels like that this upcoming season is the culmination of years of work, years of adjustment, and years of adapting and evolving from Lane Kiffin and this entire Rebel football program. There are a lot of people that legitimately expect Ole Miss to compete for a national championship this year. And I got to be honest with you, I cannot remember the last time where that was the case. Maybe the early part of the previous decade, but it's been a minute, to say the least. Do you think that this is the Rebel team that can finally break through, that can make it to the college football playoff, especially now the fact that 12 teams are going to be playing in it?
Yes, I do think that Ole Miss can make the playoff. In fact, I will go a little bit further. I think the bare minimum for an acceptable season that is not a failure is making the playoff for Ole Miss this year. They're completely all in on it. There's 50-something players on this roster that after the season is done, they're gone. So there's going to be a lot of turnover in 2025. The Grove Collective, all of that, it is completely do or die for Ole Miss football. So Lane Kiffin, I think the bare minimum is to make the playoff. I think Ole Miss needs to host a playoff game at a minimum. If you want a good season or a great season, if you want all of the accolades this season is supposed to have, give me Ole Miss versus Notre Dame in Vaught-Hemingway Stadium in mid-December. Give me Ole Miss versus Michigan in Vaught-Hemingway Stadium in December 20-something, whatever it is. I think at that point, you're playing with house money. But one step below it, just making the playoff is just kind of like, okay, it's fine, meh. And if you don't make the playoff, the season is a failure.
Just out of curiosity, Stephen, I want to go off of the hypothetical you just threw out there, wanting to host a playoff game. What do you think that would do for the entire community over there in Oxford, the entire state of Mississippi?
Oxford, Mississippi would be the largest city in the state of Mississippi that day. There would be 500,000 people in the Grove. It would be absolutely nuts. The most ridiculous that I've seen the Grove look like was in 2012 when Texas came to the Grove, and all of their fans came with it because they wanted to experience that. There was probably 250,000 people that day. If Ole Miss hosts a playoff game, it'll be the biggest game in the state of Mississippi. In the whole history of it, there'll be 500,000 people in that town that has 25,000 people in it. And the atmosphere and everything surrounding that game would be something Mississippi's never seen.
Ole Miss definitely one of the biggest teams to watch this upcoming season, and South Carolina's matchup against them certainly one of the most intriguing for Gamecock fans, not just because of Juice Wells, but because of the kind of game it could be when both of those teams face off later on this fall. Stephen Willis, thank you so much for coming on to today's show. For all you Locked On Gamecock viewers and listeners, and all you Locked On Rebel viewers and listeners, Locked On Ole Miss, thank y'all for tuning in as well. Y'all have a great rest of your day. We'll be sure to catch y'all on our next respective show on Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Ole Miss.